It's crazy for the for the Ukrainians to be giving access to Starlink, funded by the Baltic states and Poland, of course, provided by Elon Musk. That's vital, and then allow the Russians to have access to the same service. That's called shooting yourself in the foot. Measures have been taken against that, and my understanding is that the Ukrainian advances, at least on the Russian side, Russian commanders have been attributed to the fact that they were cut off from Starlink. If that's a technological fix that can give the Ukrainians help at the moment, then that is something that absolutely the West should secure.
Well, the world talks about peace. Ukraine is being offered international control, pressured into elections, and pushed toward negotiations that look increasingly one-sided. To break it down, I'm joined by Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at Friends of Europe and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Welcome to our program.
Thank you, Sofia, for inviting me back. Pleasure to be with you today.
Russia has floated the idea of placing Ukraine under temporary international administration, allegedly under a UN mandate. This is a serious diplomatic proposal or just a modern version of colonial thinking disguised as a conflict management?
Well, the devil is in the detail, as diplomats like to say. And one thing is certain, which is that Ukraine cannot cede sovereignty over territory that it still controls. This is Ukrainian territory. It's not UN territory, and it's certainly not Russian territory. And obviously, any arrangement for sort of free zones on the border in the Donbas in particular has to maintain the principle of Ukrainian sovereignty and mustn't simply become a cover for some kind of creeping occupation or creeping annexation by Russia, particularly Russian military forces or Russian police forces, as happened in Crimea back in 2014. So although the Ukrainians obviously want to be nice to the Americans and not dismiss this kind of idea out of hand as a possible compromise in terms of the way towards a ceasefire and a peace agreement, clearly Ukraine has to be very, very careful that any arrangement like this, which leaves the status of Ukrainian territory somewhat sort of ambiguous or in the hands of an international administration, is backed up by very, very, very firm security guarantees, including from the United States, to ensure, as I said before, that it won't simply become a kind of pretext for a creeping Russian annexation in disguise. So let's see. But the idea has been around for a long time already, and the fact that it hasn't yet been pinned down between the United States and Ukraine in the context of the negotiations with Russia makes me feel that clearly from a Ukrainian point of view, there's not yet a satisfactory technical solution, political solution on the table.
And is this idea of international administration being discussed anywhere outside Russia? I mean, we didn't hear something like that from Europeans. And why should Ukraine even consider agreeing to this option?
Well, as I said, I think Ukraine has to be very careful. I mean, look at Gaza. We've had a ceasefire in Gaza, although it's been a very fragile and tenuous one for the last 6 months or so. But there's no international administration in Gaza. There's no security force in Gaza yet. I know that Trump's Board of Peace is meeting this week to discuss all of this. But in 6 months, nothing has happened, because it's easy to sort of posit these ideas in principle, an international administration, but then have people who are really willing to carry it out, put the security forces in, fund it and manage it. It's a different story altogether. So what we have to make sure here is that things that are put down on paper in a diplomatic negotiation are actually implementable to the letter and not twisted in the implementation later on. And in terms of who would be providing this international administration, that's far from clear at the moment. Obviously, as I've said, it has to be linked to robust Ukrainian security guarantees. And I'm not sure that at the moment the United Nations, for example, is in a position to carry out that kind of administration or to obviously provide those kind of security guarantees that would be required. So I'm sure that Russia likes this idea, because obviously from Putin's point of view, if he's losing 30,000, 35,000 soldiers at the moment for every square kilometre of Ukrainian territory that he's able to take. The notion of getting something for nothing, territory through negotiation, is obviously a very attractive one. So I'm sure that the Russians like this idea, but that's not what matters. The key question is that is this in the interest of Ukraine, and is this compatible with Ukraine's continuous sovereignty over its own territory?
Now we are approaching another round of talks between Ukraine, Russia and the US in Geneva, and Moscow is sending Vladimir Medinsky, a figure known more for ideological narratives and also false historical lectures than basically real compromise and real solutions on the ground. What does his presence tell us about the true nature of the upcoming peace talks?
It's not very encouraging because although obviously this individual is close to the Kremlin, you're right, on previous occasions he likes to sort of lecture the Ukrainians on his version of Ukrainian history, which not many sort of serious professional historians would endorse. And he clearly is not, a person who is a serious diplomatic negotiator with a mandate to negotiate and reach compromises. And the person who was there before, not ideal either, and not particularly senior, was at least linked to the Russian security establishment in the intelligence services, so clearly was in a better position to know what he was discussing. So it's not particularly encouraging. It doesn't suggest that Russia is remotely yet ready to make compromises on its part, for example, regarding the size of its future army, the withdrawal of its forces from occupied Ukrainian territory, payments of reparations, cooperation on war crimes, the sort of things that Ukraine and the international community are demanding. So it tends to suggest to me that Russia is happy to go through the motions of negotiating to try to convince the Americans that somehow they are seriously interested in a peace, while of course not really being interested in a peace and carrying on with the Russian offensive, particularly as the winter comes to an end, the spring and summer approaches, and maybe Russia believes that the terrain is more favorable for those kind of offensives. Clearly, it's only when Russia sends a much higher level delegation, a ministerial level, clearly with a mandate to negotiate seriously, that we'll see a sort of a change of attitude there. So yes, that led many people at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, such as the president of Latvia, to be quite gloomy, frankly, quite pessimistic about the prospects of a peace deal in 2026.
Russia refuses not only all demands from Ukrainian and European side, but also continues to insist on territorial demands and on full occupation of Donbas and even some recognition from all countries of Russian occupation of Crimea and other territories. At the same time, Ukraine categorically rejects this idea, and the question is the peace progress structurally blocked, or is Russia just deliberately dragging it out to reshape the battlefield, maybe by time? And what's your take on that?
Well, as I said a moment ago, I do think that Russia is playing for time. Putin, Lavrov, these people have not changed their maximalist demands one single iota. They want all of the concessions to be on the side of Kyiv, including this idea of having elections while the war is still continuing, which is contrary to Ukrainian constitution. And again, we see President Trump going backwards and forwards, and again this week in some of his statements implying that it's up to President Zelenskyy to feel the pressure and to make the concessions. I think the Europeans badly need to get involved in these peace negotiations in some way or another to be able to sort of give Kyiv more support on this. It's also clear to my mind that Russia will not make serious concessions until there is much much more pressure from sanctions. And in Munich over the weekend, there was lots of talk about, tougher action against Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers. Russia still is operating about 1,000 of these on the high seas. There's been, recently some good signs, the UK, France, US getting more involved in boarding these ships, the Baltic states as well, changes to European legislation to allow a tougher line to be taken. But last week, Denmark was reporting that 400 Russian tankers within a single month had moved through the Danish Straits from the Baltic into the North Sea. So this activity is still going on, other kinds of sanctions. So yes, that debate is continuing, but until we see decisive action in really tightening up Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales and other kinds of economic activity, the Kremlin, although losing lots and lots of soldiers, isn't going to feel backed into a corner and feel the financial pressure to cut its losses and stop the conflict. So, to my mind, there are many other elements of strategy that need to be put in place to really get Russia to negotiate seriously. And of course, the other side of that is, of course, stepping up the provision of air defense weapons, of long-range artillery, co-production of drones, all of these things to help the Ukrainian army not to lose further territory, continue to impose a very high price in casualties on Russia, and therefore to convince Russia that it's gone as far in Ukraine as it's going to be able to go at a remotely acceptable price. I mean, Putin feels at the moment that he can live with 1 million casualties and continue, but if he has 1,500,000 casualties or 2 million plus casualties, maybe that calculus in the eyes of the Kremlin would change. So there are a lot of these other elements that have to be put in place to really give Russia, if you like, positive inducements in its own interest to negotiate. And there's talk, but until there is action, I think Putin, to answer your question, will continue to play for time, yes.
Since you already mentioned the topic of the elections, Financial Times reports that the United States is pushing for Ukraine to hold elections on May 15th. And I also read some articles that basically Trump wants to make a deal between Ukraine and Russia before Congress elections. And of course, Ukrainian side says that elections are only possible after 2 months ceasefire. At the same time, yesterday, Russian officials released a statement that they could ensure no shelling and one-day ceasefire during the elections. What's your reaction on the Russian statement? Why actually Ukraine should believe them? Because we know they also promised energy ceasefire, but it lost only 4 days. And why is the American side pushing for the elections right now?
Well, so I think that we had that statement from President Trump, but it's interesting that Marco Rubio didn't say much about Ukraine in his speech in Munich and didn't seem to be sort of echoing that view of the administration in his speech or in his other bilateral meetings. He had, of course, a quick meeting with Zelenskyy as well, that elections should take place right away. I mean, clearly it's not realistic. I mean, first of all, you can't hold proper elections in wartime. No democratic country has had it. In my country, the UK, we had a national government from 1940 to 1945, but we didn't have the elections until Hitler had been defeated and the Second World War was over. That's the way that it has to be. You need proper voter registration. You need all of the 6 to 7 million Ukrainians who have had to flee abroad to be properly registered, to be able to participate in some way or another. You need a proper campaign. And it's very nice of President Putin to suggest that he would halt the bombing for 24 hours while people actually vote, if anybody believed him. But that's not what an election is. An election is also a campaign extending over several weeks where people are able to freely go into the towns and villages and to hold rallies. Who would hold a rally bringing a couple of hundred people together if there were a prospect of a Russian bombardment taking place during that period? It would be completely impossible and unthinkable. And President Zelenskyy, I think, was quite robust also in his intervention at the Munich Security Conference in pushing back against the notion that elections can be held while the war is still going on. And therefore, the Russian argument, which is because there's not been an election, somehow President Zelenskyy is not the legitimate leader of Ukraine, that's bogus. So the Russians will continue to play for these arguments, particularly if they think Trump might pick them up and echo them. But I think there was a very firm response from Ukraine and Europe in Munich on that score over the weekend.
One of the key outcomes discussed in Munich was the possibility of US security guarantees for Ukraine for 15 years. It was announced by Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and he said at the same time Kyiv is asking for 35 to 50 years security guarantees. Is such a long-term guarantee realistic in the current US political system?
Well, we've had in NATO a situation where the United States has extended a security guarantee to Europe now for nearly 80 years, and that still continues. So these obviously are permanent arrangements when a country is part of your democratic family, with the prospect, of course, of EU membership, even if in Munich nobody was willing on the European side to set a firm date for Ukraine's EU membership. And of course, the length of those security guarantees has to depend upon the situation. How big, how long will the Russian threat last? How self-reliant will Ukraine be with its own army in the future? But given that Ukraine is going to be a part of the European Union and in Munich, Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, was calling for the EU to develop its own security guarantee to its member states under Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, which provides for that. Then clearly we need a permanent security guarantee for Ukraine, the same that the EU and NATO offer to all of their member states at the moment. I mean, 15 years may be good in terms of what the Americans are willing to commit to, particularly for the US Congress to endorse this and for the US to be fully participating in that in the first phase. I think that's important for deterrence vis-a-vis Moscow. But of course, in the longer run, I think we know that security guarantee has to be largely a European affair, albeit hopefully with some American backing, like in NATO, but essentially a European affair. And therefore, I think, we need to talk about maybe an initial 15-year arrangement, but transitioning to another formula, which could be NATO, EU 42.7, that article, European troops staying in Ukraine over the long run. But to my mind, it has to be, from now on, a permanent thing, which is what European integration provides for its member states.
And it's also interesting to discuss from Moscow's perspective. Would Russia ever accept a peace deal that includes strong, binding security guarantees for Ukraine? And do you think that this topic, security guarantees for Ukraine, should be on the table in terms of discussions with Russia, or we can just have security guarantees and do not ask Russians about their opinion, and that's it?
Well, I certainly think that we, as I've said before on your program, that we can't accept the kind of paper guarantees, the Budapest memoranda and those kind of approaches we had in the past, because we know that Putin doesn't respect them. So that's out. Number two, we have to have, obviously, security guarantees that deter Russia from future attacks by making it crystal clear that any violation of the peace agreement by Russia will be met with a firm response, including a military response. And that's provided for in the current three-stage plan of response that the Americans and the Ukrainians and European countries have worked out together. Thirdly, it has to provide for a large Ukrainian army, which would not be limited in terms of size, not below 800,000 troops, with reserves or other types of weaponry that Ukraine is able to have. And it's in the European interest, because nobody has any interest in weak security guarantees leading to a future Russian invasion, and which is simply going to bring us back into this sort of cycle of helping Ukraine and arming and interventions that we've had already. We have to break free of that that scenario, that syndrome, I think, rather decisively. So if Russia continues to say no to that, that's an area where clearly the West has to push back, and very, very, very firmly indeed push back. After the Cold War, the Kremlin did not want to give the right of Eastern European countries to be members of NATO. And Yeltsin at the time threatened all kinds of reprisals if that perspective of NATO membership were given. But the West stuck to its guns, was firm what it wanted, was firm what it needed for European security, and pushed back on that. And that's an area which is really not negotiable. And the United States and Europeans, Ukraine, have to be crystal clear and be very firm on that, and put pressure on Moscow to accept that there won't be a peace agreement in Ukraine without those security guarantees. Of course, the Kremlin are great at threatening and bluffing and saying over their dead body. They always say that. But look at the 1990s, where firmness and unity on the Western side paid off, and the Eastern Europeans were given the military security guarantees that they required.
You know, one interesting point, a couple of days ago, The Telegraph published an article about a counteroffensive of Ukraine. According to the media, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive after Russian forces were cut off from Starlink. Do you think this move could create an additional pressure, at least, and maybe strengthen Ukrainians' position during these peace talks?
I definitely think it's the way to go, because it's crazy for the Ukrainians to be giving access to Starlink, funded by the Baltic states and Poland, of course, provided by Elon Musk. That's vital, and then allow the Russians to have access to the same service. That's called shooting yourself in the foot. Measures have been taken against that, and my understanding is that the Ukrainian advances, at least on the Russian side, Russian commanders have been attributed to the fact that they were cut off from Starlink. If that's a technological fix that can give the Ukrainians help at the moment, then that is something that absolutely the West should secure, because in war, the first principle is that you don't help your enemy. And if by buying Russian oil, at one stage in Europe, we were spending more buying Russian oil than we were giving to Ukraine in weapons, or not, leaving lots of loopholes in the sanctions so the Russians can get military technology, for example, giving them access to things like Starlink. Those are the obvious things that we simply shouldn't be doing. And so at least that avenue seems to be closed off at the moment. But once it's closed off, we have to make sure that it continues to be closed off, because, of course, we know that the Kremlin are experts in finding workarounds, different circuits, use of organized crime circuits, sanctions evasion. They're very good at all of that. So that's an area which requires constant vigilance by the NATO allies.
And my last topic for today, according to a recent survey published by Politico, Western societies increasingly believe a global war is coming. And according to the published survey, majorities in the US, Canada, the UK, France, and Germany say the world is becoming more dangerous, and the World War III is more likely than not within the next 5 years. Where do you think we are actually right now on the escalation ladder? And looking back at the takeaways from the Munich, from the security conference, did the overall picture suggest the readiness for new threats or a dangerous lack of it?
Well, it's true that we live in a more dangerous world today, but that doesn't make a future global war inevitable. We know from the experience of the 1930s that the refusal to make a stand, for example, over Hitler's reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, or his annexation of Austria in 1938, his invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939, and in Poland, we know that the refusal to make a stand only encouraged dictators to think that they could get away with everything, that the democracies were weak and wouldn't impose them. So we got into a war in 1939, 1940, largely by mistake, by failing to convince the authoritarian powers that we were serious when we really were. And I think today everybody recognizes that the Ukraine is, if you like, the Rhineland of the 21st century, in the way that conflict ends will largely determine if we have a global war, if we don't. If Ukraine survives as an independent sovereign state with those security guarantees, if Putin is seen to have failed, then not only Russia, but many other authoritarians around the world will be very, very careful and cautious before they start these aggressions in the future, because they'll see that they don't work and they pay a very, very heavy price. So Ukraine is not just important for Ukrainians, but it's important for the security of all of the NATO member states. Ukraine is not losing the war. Ukraine is still in a position, it demonstrates this every day, to resist Russia, to push back. Russia is a weak country compared with the Europeans and NATO in terms of military spending, in terms of economic growth. It has weaknesses, and we have to stop seeing the Russians as 20 feet tall and learn to exploit their weaknesses much better than we've been doing in the past. So I think Ukraine shows the dangers, but I think Ukraine also shows the opportunities of decisive policy to stop the worst from happening and to re-establish the preeminence of the rules-based international order. And after 4 years of war, those opportunities are as strong as they were today as they were back in February 2022 when Putin launched his second offensive into Ukraine. Nothing is lost and everything is still to play for, but it requires firm leadership in order to diminish the risks and exploit the opportunities.
Mr. Shea, thank you very much for being with us today and for this discussion. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
And thanks again, as always, for the invitation, and glory to Ukraine, as always.